The recaps are going to start coming with a fury after this. Um, I just wanted to catch us all up to where we are and what we've discussed so that hopefully the remainder of this class will make more sense. We started off with quite a bit of discussion of historical views of mind, which will become important again today. Then I gave some theoretical background, which was important for discussions of cognitive science and mental architectures, which included the computational theory of the mind and connectionism, both of which will be relevant to the discussion today. That was the vegetables portion of this class, where we had to discuss quite a few things that might have been a little bit abstract and a little bit hard to follow, but hopefully you stuck through it and are now able to discuss the things that you need to be able to think about before we go into our exam and presentation and final paper. So we then went into a discussion of cognition, including consciousness, cognitive illusions, perception and concepts, and how all of those might not be quite what we think they are, or they might have some nuances that are affected by our understanding of the architecture of the mind. We had a brief detour into the biology um, of cognitive science, talking about evolutionary psychology and animal cognition, which is going to lead us to the discussion that we're going to have over the next couple of periods on embodied cognition, emotions, and eventually getting into issues in neuroethics. So we're going to start off, and probably the entirety of this video will be a discussion of embodied cognition. And then the next video will be biorobotics and problems for embodied cognition. Okay. The recap that's going to be relevant here is our discussion of mental representation. If you recall, one of the key things that we're trying to capture when understanding how our minds work is how they could be about something outside of them. So what is it about a particular neuron firing that's going to create a thought that's going to connect a thought of yours with something that exists out in the world, perhaps, or in the case of a hallucination, a representation without something in the world. Content without representation, sorry. How necessary is it? And the alternative views of mental architectures, we talked about them and debated them during the vegetable portions of this class, of course. I said that in the future we are going to discuss an alternative view or two, and this is the central one. We're going to obliquely refer to some other alternatives, dynamical theories, etc. But this is the big alternative that we're going to spend some time talking about. And lastly, perception. So if you recall the discussion on perception, there's parts of it that just seem automatic, that don't seem cognitive. Some of it might be cognitive, right? There might be some processing going on, and in some cases you are even aware of it, but not necessarily. Okay. I always like to start with a little bit of history here, and this history is comes about in two different lineages that lead up to our discussion of cognitive science. So in one lineage, we go all the way back to Descartes and his separating of the mind and the body. Later, thinkers thought about being able to introspect the mind, this view called structuralism on the right, which had a direct relationship to cognitive science via a detour against it in behaviorism. And what we're going to talk about has a history in that lineage, the embodied cognitive science issue, right? So linking the mind and the body in some way. There's also a lineage that goes back to a more recent time period from Charles Darwin, And William James, in the modern pragmatists movement, this is a view called functionalism, which talked about introspection and consciousness and those things that were relevant in structuralism, but focused on being able to assess causes, behavioral and otherwise, trying to figure out what sorts of problems mental states might be solving. There's a pretty direct conceptual link to evolutionary psychology or ecological psychology if you want to avoid the taint that evolutionary psychology has received in some circles. And that lineage also influences embodied cognition. There's also a more extreme version of it, which is all of our cognition is embodied. I'm going to go through quite a few different views of embodied cognition. Usually before I give a history, I sort of try to give an account of what it is that we're talking about. But because we're talking about quite a few different views that are all like a family, have a family resemblance to each other, I'll just group them all as embodied cognition. And Margaret Wilson has a beautiful article in which she distinguishes each of these, what she considers 6 different views. And we'll take these all in turn, starting with the idea that cognition is situated. So this is the simple observation that cognitive activity takes place in a real world environment and involves perception and action. Okay, so you could think of this as saying, yes, everything that we've discussed so far is great, but it happens in a world that's changing around us. Well, there's some sense in which this is uncontroversial. And there's another sense in which if you're going to try to attach it to some evolutionary story, which a lot of embodied cognition advocates are want to do, it's not obvious that it's true. And we'll talk about some other particular traits that seem like they're unique to humans that don't seem like they're necessarily situated in the world. You can have abstract planning, imagining, hypothetical reasoning, so to speak. And so it might not be the case that all of your cognition is in the world. Sometimes you're thinking about things that are not in the world yet or ever. So yes, there's some part of cognition that's in the world. And if you take that in the trivial sense, that's not impressive. If you try to build it up a little bit more and beef it up, there's some stuff that's left out, and it's not obvious that the stuff that's not left out is true. Okay. Well, what about another alternative that's sometimes proposed by some people, that we are a mind on the hoof? Cognition ought to be understood in terms of pressures of real-time interaction with the environment. So recall back to our discussion of classical computationalism, this view of the mind as a computer, or perhaps our discussion of rational choice theory. In each of these, we pointed out that, well, our mind can't really be a computer. There's limits that we have, and these limits affect our decision-making, and sometimes in predictably negative ways. But we don't have an infinite amount of time to spend dedicating to the problems that we face. And that's true. And in fact, sometimes when we think about it, we realize we're actually pretty bad at this. So Wilson actually says maybe that's evidence that cognition being time pressured is not going to be the way of thinking about cognition that's going to win out at the end. Namely that, yes, we're time pressured, but it's not like we're particularly good at being time pressured. And so if that's what cognition was, about solving problems quickly, you think we'd be better at that than we are. But our really impressive features, the aspects of our cognition that we brag about, are the ones that aren't time pressured. Those are the planning, the thinking 3 chess moves ahead. And in fact, if you try to model a system that is purely time pressured, it's hard to scale it up to something that resembles how we process the world. Okay, so cognition is in the world. Well, sometimes sort of, yes, but it doesn't explain the impressive aspects of human consciousness, and it might not be true biologically. Cognition is time pressured. Well, it is, but if that's what cognition was, it just is time pressured reasoning, you'd think we'd be better at it. The things that are most impressive of our cognition are not that. Okay. What about an alternative view that we offload cognitive work onto the environment? So sometimes you write notes. Sometimes you put things out into the world. You remember where you put things in your room because that is easier than trying to remember everything all at once. Perhaps we could think about cognition as being embodied in this way. We have some limits in our information processing abilities, so we exploit the environment. We do that to reduce workload. We make it hold or manipulate information for us. That's what computers are. That's what your phones are. That's what the internet is. That's what a chalkboard is. So we offload work into the environment. There's a really cool thing about this that I want to point out before we move on to the criticisms of it. Your extended mind, in a way, allows you to focus on other problems, right? Like you put things on your to-do list so that you don't have to keep wasting memory space to try to remember them. This is an interesting aspect of how we reason. And in fact, when you don't do that, when your mind is busy with all of your to-do lists that you haven't yet accomplished, it feels really cluttered. But again, there's some cases that aren't situated in this way. And perhaps there's not new. All right. Okay. So another version of that, or at least a different interpretation of that, might be that the environment just is part of cognition. It's not that we put all of our notes elsewhere. It's that we need this world around us to think through things. When I'm thinking about how I plan my class, it's really hard to think it through. I have to like put it on a visual medium to like see how the parts fit together. If you're working on a long proof, it's hard to do it all in your head. In this view, the information flow between mind and the world is so dense and continuous that you ought not just study the mind alone. Cool. Well, I mean, that's just a more extreme version of the previous view. And there's a part of it that's plausibly or is trivially true, right? Like the world is involved in your decision making. But it's not obvious that it's essential to your decision making. So maybe it would take you longer to do a math proof without writing it down. Maybe you need things around you to be a certain way to think about them, but well, maybe you don't need things around you to think about them. It's not yet shown, is the point. So you might think, okay, we're talking about cognition, and we want to think about it in terms of what is going on Um, and all of the previous approaches, all of the previous mental architectures have been purely structural. They haven't involved the nature in any way. They haven't involved the world in any way. But a lot of the things that we need to do in our day-to-day lives are move around in the world and act. Um, and in that sense, then what we need to be doing is thinking about the mind as an acting agent. It's not just a processing agent. That's not the important part of what we do. We act. And yet, that was one of the big objections to behaviorism, if you recall, was that sometimes mice were able to learn a maze without being given rewards. So there's just learning going on. You're processing without needing necessarily to act or without even thinking about how you're going to act. If cognition were for action, then you would think that you'd only represent things that you need to act upon. But we represent lots of things. Okay, before I discuss the last one, I need to introduce a distinction between online and offline cognition. It's already come up more or less in the previous discussions. But the different, so online is something that sort of like akin to cognition is for action. Cognitive activity that you're engaging in the real world in some real sense. Offline is planning ahead, is the thoughts that you have when you don't need to immediately act, the thoughts that you have when you're planning a conversation rather than having a conversation. And so one response to the previous view that cognition is for action or that cognition is in the world in some way is to say, well, there's a part of cognition that is for action. That the online cognition is definitely for action. But some people have gone an extra step further and said, no, what's going on even in the offline cases when you're planning a chess move or dreaming or planning a conversation or planning your semester, that is just a bunch of separate imaginings of online activity. Let me say that again. Even the most abstract thinking that you have, your thinking involves thinking about many, many small activities, and those are the ones that are certainly embodied. And so we need to be thinking about everything as embodied. Okay. So if you think about mental imagery, memories, encoding memories, even like just sentence claims that you know to be true and remembering factoids. A lot of those are going to be remembered from a perceptive standpoint, from your position, and then they're going to start being incorporated as other information that you can then use for immediate action. All right, so I've previewed in this section a lot of the stuff that we're going to get into in the final section, which is really just one slide. But the basic idea is a lot of people have been pushing for the idea that all that we've been talking about this semester has ignored the role of the body. We've been ignoring what it is to think through, to act through actions. And so there's a lot of varieties that we talked about, right? Going from being in the world to being time pressured to being about action to being about, you know, I guess just offloading. The idea being that your body involves more cognition than you think, and in fact, it might not make sense to think of your mind without your body. Contra Descartes, way back in the day. In the next section, I'm going to build up an entirely different approach to it, and hopefully they will converge. And then I'll raise some problems for that. That'll be the next video.